characters, historical characters, that I found very inspiring is Hypatia. What is quite unusual to me is that today Hypatia is not really well known. I don't think it's a mainstream character that we reach out to. However, in her times, she was a highly recognized woman, remarkably talented astronomer. And what we know of her life today, she was one of the most renowned mathematicians of the time. And we'll discover all of this a little bit more. Before I go to her life and history of Alexandria, and progressively through the talk, try to extract together with you some of the teachings that we can have for today, I wanted to set us in the particular mindset, or perhaps to give us a framework how to look at this topic in a more engaging way. Because sometimes we engage with history rather in a very dry sense, informational perhaps, and we tend to lose ourselves in the vast information of what we have about the history of humanity for that period of time. But philosophically speaking, when we take a look at history, it's like connecting in a certain ways with our roots. Because in reality, philosophically, if we observe it in this way, is humanity is one. And so certain lessons of history are lessons that today can help us look at our problems, our challenges today from a different perspective. But a perspective that has been based on the experiences of those generations before us. And when we take a look at the history that way, I always find that we are sitting on the tremendous mountain of wisdom from which we can learn from if we choose to do so. Jorge Livraga, who is the founder, or who was the founder, he is not alive anymore, of New Acropolis, he always approached history as a springboard to a future human evolution. And I always find this interesting, that there is a close kinship, relationship between the history and our future. The same way as for us as individuals, there is a close connection between the memory and our imagination, or that is to say, our ability to project ourselves into the future. And so if I can leave this sentiment, there is much more to explain about this. As Marcella was saying, we have a course that is Introduction into Philosophy for Living, where we explore this a little bit more. But if I could leave you with this sentiment, I hope that this can give a different perspective to why we speak of the classical historical figures like Hypatia. It's one of the most famous female philosophers, or that is to say, the most documented as well, although we know very, very little of her life. Generally, also, we know very little of her writings, nearly to none. So about her life, we know from secondary sources, so to say. And no matter what book you take, what research you do, you're always going to get to core information that everybody is trying to recreate the life of this philosopher. However, we do have different references from which we can learn about her life, lifestyle, attitude, starting with the fact that she was a Neoplatonic philosopher. And I'll explore a little bit more about that. So let's talk a little bit about the life of Hypatia. She was born in 355 AD in the academic elite of Alexandria. So Alexandria is a city that was quite remarkable in its time, and what we know, it was born out of a dream of Alexander the Great. It was always supposed to be a cultural Hellenistic city of erudition, of knowledge, in which many different cultures and civilizations crossed and lived and coexisted together. I believe that Alexandria itself was founded by Ptolemy in 330 AD. So as you can see, Hypatia is born just at the very beginnings of Alexandria. She was a daughter of Theon of Alexandria, who was a great scholar of the time, of the Alexandrian library, and he was a very renowned mathematician and astronomer. He's accounted for, or I'm missing the word right now, to be able to predict eclipses of sun and the moon, etc. So the astronomical, the knowledge of astronomy and of mathematics allow them to observe nature and predict certain movements in nature. So the education that Hypatia has received, her father was quite interested in giving her a space to explore her talents in mathematics, in scholarship, philosophy above all, which was quite unusual for a woman of the time. Okay, so Hypatia in her lifestyle was quite unusual and recognized not only for her knowledge, but for her exceptionally integral way of living. So what we're going to see is she was a beautiful woman, according to all records. And there is one particular story that I don't want to spend time right on, but she was a beautiful young woman that dressed as a scholar, which is like a toga of a scholar she wore, which again was quite unusual for a woman. And she was active in a public eye quite a lot. She was giving public lectures that were highly attended on a variety of subjects. And to public, she most often gave the lectures of philosophical content, where they explore different philosophers, starting with Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, etc. Less interesting lectures, of course, would be mathematics and astronomy, etc. But she really drew public attention. She was a great speaker. Now, what is something that is quite remarkable about Hypatia as a philosopher, first and foremost, she was a Neoplatonic philosopher. And she, at the time, was also a head of a Neoplatonic school of philosophy. What her interest was never in the reins of power, politics, etc. However, due to her character, the art and science of living virtuously, she was very highly regarded as an individual with integrity, capable of acting justly, and somebody who has been perceived to contain wisdom, that is to say, inner authority. Okay, it's something that we find in Alexandria, that philosophy and philosophical principles are starting to be more intellectually explored, but people are not living them anymore. And this is where this philosophical wisdom, or the ability to live wisely, to discover wisdom in our actions in a day-to-day life, is getting lost. And with that, individuals like Hypatia herself are standing up due to the qualities of her character. That's why in many different situations, she's going to be called to counsel by many political figures. She's going to be called upon to counsel in the conflicts, etc., because her counsel mattered. She was capable of giving an advice to overcome a conflict or approach a difficulty in a ways that others were not able to. Her contemporary, his name is Socrates Scholasticus, so it's not the Socrates whom we know. He wrote a small paragraph that quite well captures how Hypatia was perceived, and I would like to read it to you. So he was saying, there was a woman at Alexandria named Hypatia. She was a daughter of the philosopher Theon, who made such attainments in literature and science as to far surpass all the philosophers of her own time. Having succeeded to the school of Plato and Plotinus, she explained the principles of philosophy to her auditors, many of whom came from a distance to receive her instructions. On account of the self-possession and ease of manner which she had acquired in consequence of the cultivation of her mind, she not infrequently appeared in public in the presence of the magistrates. Neither did she feel abashed in going to an assembly of men, for all men, on account of her extraordinary dignity and virtue, admired her the more. So what we can see is she was an individual that carried herself with a certain dignity and virtue, even in the times of quite turbulent times of Alexandria. Okay, and this is something where you're going to see that the challenges that Alexandria as a city is going through, perhaps in a small way, we see the challenges that in the world today we are faced with that make us uncertain. And perhaps with this example of Hypatia and Alexandria, we can extract something that is of value to us today. And to invite us to a certain practice, perhaps a philosophical practice of cultivating the same dignity and same virtue that she is an example of. She herself, as I mentioned, she was attributed as well to be a marvelous astronomer and mathematician, and one of achievements, if I can say so, is that she built Astrolab. It's a simple instrument that allows us to measure time, positioning of the stars, etc., which is actually quite a complex achievement. But one of the things is that I thought it's quite remarkable is she continues in the footsteps of her father. The focus of the time was really to retain the knowledge. So you can imagine that frantically they were trying to retain the mathematical knowledge of humanity, because obviously when we take a look at the rest of the history, knowledge was getting lost in many different ways. And this was happening with Alexandria as well. You're probably familiar with the Library of Alexandria and Museum of Alexandria. Okay, because one of the things in Alexandria that we find is this erudition, strive to contain all the knowledge of the world with a tremendous effort of many, many scholars. For instance, to be a member of museum, a person had to transcribe a book, recreate a book, and to give it as a present to museum. And it's quite remarkable when you think about it, how valuable books were. Today, we replace this idea with a World Wide Web. So we don't necessarily perhaps appreciate the effort that they had to put in. But just to give us an idea, what will happen at some stage? You're familiar with it. A library is going to be burned down. At the height of its development, it contained about 500,000 books, which is quite remarkable. And the majority of that knowledge is going to be destroyed. But knowledge in itself, it's not being lost only by losing books. It's also that the individuals anymore show no interest in that knowledge, because the only way to truly pass on the knowledge, and above all wisdom, is through transmission from a person to person. Okay. If a knowledge in itself is not something that is lived and remains intellectual, it's very hard to pass it on, to understand it, to comprehend it, and to make it to something living. In this environment, what they are trying to do is really to retain knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, etc. So it was a colossal effort, not only of Hypatia, but many, many scholars of the time. It is also the time where in Alexandria, we start to see first frictions and first imbalances in the city. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Alexandria as a city was a crossroad of many different religions, schools of thought, sciences, philosophies. It is where everything mixed. And you can imagine that that was a very dynamic city. And the rule or the main virtue or the main ideal of Alexandria was the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, which in itself requires quite a lot of strength and courage, isn't it? However, progressively, due to different changes, we start seeing the first forms of dogmatism emerging. It's not quite indifferent to the world that we are living in. So the first fanatical movements and certain groups start expressing discomfort with the different points of view. And while everybody agrees that it's okay to have a different point of view and nobody imposes their way of living to others, this coexistence can work well. But when people start disengaging from this ideal and start imposing their worldview onto everybody else, then we start to see frictions. And in this case, and in this time of history, this is what's happening with Christianity at the time. One of the fractions of the society is that is motivated quite a lot by Cyril of Alexandria, before him by Theophilus, who was a Christian patriarch. We are starting to see more emergence of more dogmatic Christianity. We can study history more to understand why this appears this way, etc. But that's not the point of the talk. I want to kind of put you in the mindset to start understanding the tensions that are happening in the city. And they are going to start attacking Jews. And this is going to create a ripple of events that in the end are going to bring down Alexandria to its knees, really. Because Alexandria had intellectual knowledge of 700 years old tradition, and that was crumbling. The values of Alexandria were crumbling. The unfortunate thing that is going to happen is that this conflict between secular power and spiritual power is at some stage going to impact Hypatia herself. To explain a little bit more is a Cyril of Alexandria, who was a Christian. You could understand it as a Pope of Alexandria, but it's a slightly different position. A bishop, perhaps, and a prefect or governor of Alexandria, whose name is Orestes, are going to come in conflict for various reasons. Mainly because Orestes is focused on the political power, the governing of the city. But Cyril, who is a spiritual leader in Christianity, he starts to want to have that political, secular power as well. And this is where the friction is going to come. However, Orestes was a disciple of Hypatia. Because remember that Hypatia was a Neoplatonic philosopher. And one of the characteristics of Neoplatonism was a tremendous ability, and this is the main achievement of Neoplatonism, to bring together, like a bouquet of flowers. It's like a little thread that connects all the flowers together, right? Of different schools of thoughts. And this is tremendous if you think about it. It's different schools of thoughts. It could be a religion, it could be science, it could be philosophy, it could be art, politics, it doesn't matter. So what they recognize, and this is a really quite a remarkable thing to consider, is they were able, by focusing on that which is essential, reconcile many differences in different branches of the human knowledge. That is to say, they introduce us, they're the ones who were able to reconcile East and West. Quite beautiful, isn't it? So to say, it's like to find a unifying language between all these different languages of knowledge. Because one of the things that they did is they continued in the Platonic tradition and said, in order to be able to see and understand something beyond that which is different, I need to focus on that which is essential. And in itself, already, this is quite a deep teaching in itself, right? But what Plato says, and they continue in this tradition, is to encourage individuals to recognize that which unifies us all, despite our differences, as the only way, by focusing on that which is higher beyond our differences. They would say ideals, to focus every individual to seek the unity with each other, despite our differences. Because let's be frank, we have many differences, right? And we all know it's not so simple to reconcile them. So we need to change the inner positioning, they say. And in the same mindset, in the same spirit, Hypatia taught. Her disciples were Christians as well. And for instance, Synesius was one of her closest disciples. He was a Christian bishop and very renowned Christian scholar. So it is possible to be a philosopher and be philosopher artist, philosopher mystic, and philosopher scientist, etc. Because philosophy is something that allows us, enables us to seek for wisdom in everything we do. Because, to come back, because Cyril himself could not overpower Orestes, he's going to focus on Hypatia in order to discourage Orestes to continue in his activities, because Hypatia was very close to Orestes, a very important individual to Orestes. And what is going to happen, although Cyril didn't instigate this attack, but he definitely contributed to this instability of the whole situation, this will result in the murder of Hypatia. To give you an example of tension that was in the city at that time, you can imagine the situation that we have with Afghanistan right now, where on the surface still things are so unstable and so uncertain, but there's a great deal of tension that we don't know in which direction it is going to go. So that's the atmosphere of Alexandria at the time. And this also shows the integrity that Hypatia had, not to deviate from her way of life nor inner objectives, despite the dangers that she faced as a human being, as a philosopher of that time. And so the crowd, instigated by the Parabalani monks, are going to capture her in her chariot. They're going to murder her in the church and quite brutally, and dismember her body and burn it. So it was quite a violence for whatever reason. With her death, what we know today is that the whole intellectual heritage and tradition in Alexandria crumbles. So her contribution was quite tremendous. Now, hearing all of this, I always stop and think, what can we take away from this experience of humanity? Okay. And why at all choosing to talk about Hypatia? Because somewhat we think this may not be related to me. However, at the same time, although we are not in the situation of in which she found herself in, it is quite remarkable to learn and to see how could she retain such a moral integrity under such pressure. And although we are not in her shoes, we kind of feel and sense that that's also some of the challenges that we are facing today in our own way and to our own measure. I always say, we sometimes think that we need to defend our values and we need to defend our integrity in the big things of life. But with time and reflection and practice, something that in philosophy is quite important, we start to realize that our challenges are really in the details. You know the saying, the devil is in the detail, in the small things of life. Because in the small things of life, we need to reassert ourselves to life to say, I am close to my values. I am capable of being an ethical human being. And I'm following the call of my consciousness, isn't it? So when the big things of life come, I'm prepared. At least I'm familiar. I have something to rely on. I have gained some experience, and this is important. Why? To have the courage and a certain level of humility to engage with the small things of life, because they're important and they matter. How did she retain her integrity as a human being, as a philosopher, despite the adversities of life? The philosophical proposition would always say, and Hypatia is the same, but many different philosophers of East and West remind us always of the same advice. The first step is to know ourselves and to master ourselves. And that's always a foundation. It is who I am, to choose who I am, and to become an ethical human being. Now, don't get scared. Okay, I'm not suggesting that nobody isn't, etc. What they just introduce is the possibility that we can improve as human beings, and I think that we can agree on that. Okay, this is very important. It is to develop an ability to do good in all aspects of our actions. And good, it also encompasses that it's closer to that which is true. It is closer to that which is harmonious and beautiful. It is closer to that which is just, good, generous, etc. So it is to develop our ability to do good in all aspects of our actions and in all circumstances of life. When we find ourselves in the uncertainties or in the front of the challenges of life, the first reaction we usually take is we focus on the external things. But remember, while we have external things, they have nothing to do with who we are. However we look at it, it has nothing to do with who I am at my core. So that is to say, when we seek to build confidence, we somewhat have a tendency to go external. And we think that we are going to gain in more security by having whatever we are pursuing to have. There are many different forms. However, anything that is external to us, even our family, is something that comes and goes. So philosophically, what we are more concerned is how do we develop the art and science of being the best I can be. Okay. And so to say is, in the uncertain times, what is important is to develop inner certainties that are within. Okay. And what are these inner certainties? Well, it is my moral strength, my moral qualities, who are like a tool that allow me to face any challenge of life with imagination, with confidence, with courage, with dignity. Right. And so this is something that I always find as a first challenge for when we engage with philosophy, is to start to understand that a tremendous potential of the human being to do good, be an ethical person, that is to say, to become an truthful to oneself, the best of who I can be, is developed progressively by developing our moral character through reflection and practice. What impact does this have? Well, we develop an inner perspective. Hypatia, Neoplatonic philosophers, Greek philosophers, Buddhists, etc., they say by developing an inner perspective, so to say, we can reach the point in us where we can breathe inside, and where we have a great clarity. A word to describe this place is often used as a spirit, but you also can name it the inner being, the individual, the higher self, etc. So there are many different ways to describe this inner experience, the sentiment of inner being. But what they all say is when we are able to bring ourselves to our highest aspirations, to our ideals, we are able to see life with more clarity. That is to say, I can breathe. And spirit actually comes from the Greek or Latin word spiritus, which means to breathe. Not the spiritus of that we can drink, right? And so you can imagine this space is like being on the top of the mountain. When we are on the mountain peak, what we can see with clarity everything that surrounds us. And it's somewhat quiet, right? We're somewhat undisturbed. It's quite beautiful. And from this position, we can navigate where we need to go. The problem we have is when we are impacted by life is we are at the bottom of the mountain and we don't know how to climb up. Consciousness, how to get our consciousness up to be in that place where I can see with clarity and confidence. And this is and this is the work of developing our moral character, is to be able to get to these higher aspirations and to higher sentiments so that we can see with clarity where we need to go. Hypatia would explain this concept of developing moral strength as apatheia. I hope I'm pronouncing it well, but it's a philosophical state of apatheia. It's not apathy, which I know in English it's a very similar term, but it's not what is meant. It's rather the equanimity. I hope that I'm pronouncing that one well. Or the ability to remain calm and composed, especially in the difficult situations of life. And remarkably, we see in Hypatia's way of being and living exactly this quality applied to life. You can understand it as to be able to liberate ourselves from the impact and influence of our emotions and desires. Because the first challenge that we have when we face life is that life doesn't comply with what we desire it to be, isn't it? Have you noticed that? It has a tendency to deviate in all directions that we don't want to. But that's life, okay? And something similar we find in Stoicism when they say desire less. You know, it is this deep recognition there are things that I can control and that I can't control. Okay, so here, in order to be able to guide ourselves from the intelligence of the self and not be lost in the forest of our ego, we progressively need to get undisturbed by passions. That is to say, we need to start prioritizing within us. Motivations is the first step, and to observe ourselves. It is to ask why, what motivates my actions. Are my desires, emotions, fears, jealousies, insecurities, or am I guiding myself by my virtues, my values, or timeless ideals of humanity? Even better, right? Is my action motivated in courage? Is my action motivated in generosity, a sense of duty? Or am I doing it because it's comfortable? And you're going to see progressively, we are going to start to differentiate and develop this discernment, this intelligence that allows me clarity. Clarity of why, where I need to go. And then eventually, when we connect with others as well, to understand others. Okay. So by developing apatheia, the strength of character, to be guided by our moral qualities and not by our desires and our emotions, we are going to reach to a point of clarity, of knowing who I am and where I need to go and why. Okay. As you can see, this is an inner journey. It has nothing to do with something that is external to us. One more quality that I would like to expand a little bit more, because I think it's acutely needed today, is something that we find in Hypatia's life and in Neoplatonic philosophy. And why do I go back so much to Neoplatonism? Because we have very little of Hypatia's life. We need to use an understanding of philosophy that inspired her life to understand why she did certain things the way she did. And so in Neoplatonism, we find a lot of elements to understand her motivations a little bit deeper. So in Neoplatonism, what I said is this eclectic approach to life and the ability to reconcile sometimes contradicting schools of thought and uniting them in that which is essential. So to say, we start seeing there is an attitude towards life, towards others who are different than us, towards our surrounding, that has a great agility and comprehension of what is the most essential. And therefore, they can engage in a dialogue that is much more open and live active tolerance, I would say, because it's born out of the true comprehension and compassion. Okay. And this is fundamental if we wish to live together without violence. In our day-to-day, we could call this theme, quite interestingly, another person's point of view, so to say, just to bring it to something that we can practice that is closer to us. Because in our days today, we are fighting quite a lot for the freedom of speech. In some areas of the world more, in others less. But what is quite remarkable, at the same time, we are not really considering if the words that we are speaking are true, just, or good. So we have a disconnect, isn't it? It's important to cultivate the freedom of speech, but what we are missing is the responsibility for that which we say, that it is not harmful, offensive, violent towards ourselves or others. A lot of our challenges in reality are born out of our inability to meet another person's point of view, so to say, fairly and squarely, right? And sometimes when we manage, we don't necessarily treat it with a lot of courtesy. In order to be able to develop this different attitude in which we can engage in a dialogue that is much more motivated by our mutual pursuit for that which is good, true, just, of course, if that's what we want to do. It's not everybody's wish or a deep need to discover, to get closer to wisdom, I would say. But if we want to cultivate philosophical way of life, then as lovers of wisdom, it is much more important to us that that which we do, which we think, which is another form of action, or which we feel, again, is another form of action, that is closer to that which is just and good for myself and others, than a desire to be right. When we desire to be right at any cost, to win over others and to impose our point of view, well, we are not motivating with the right, we are not acting from the point of view of our inner self. The true freedom doesn't really come from our ability just to say what is on our mind or what we feel, etc. But it is more connected and actually lies within our ability to express that which is aligned with my consciousness. Just because I think it or feel it doesn't make it right. Okay? And it doesn't mean it's in alignment with my consciousness. You understand that? Because there is a disconnect between my ideals and what I do. Because there is a constant friction within me to choose between what I desire and between what is good and just. And so if you think about it in our collective sense, we see that this is something that it's widely spread. This inability to talk to each other, understand each other, comprehend each other between the different languages that we speak. Not only the national languages or the verbal language, but many different languages. Because tolerance is not in reality a widespread virtue, because it's a virtue of maturity. And to be able to gain in maturity, I need to be able to accept responsibility for my actions, for my thoughts, for my feelings, to test them if they are just, right, good, generous, etc. So this process of maturing ourselves implies progressively stepping away from our desires, likes and dislikes, mentally, emotionally, physically, and developing a strength of character. Okay. And this, another person's point of view, can be family or friend, it can be a colleague at work, somebody whom you meet at the bookstore, it doesn't matter. But what is interesting is that through the experiences with others, we are constantly tested by life to be more open, to understand and comprehend each other, which we only can do if we let go a little bit of our need to be right. Okay. And so there is a small practice that I would invite you to engage a little bit with understanding this more in practice, which is always the best way of understanding and engaging, is whenever you're interacting with other people, it is quite good to imagine ourselves to be in their position and to examine our point of view from that standpoint. So it's to imagine ourselves to be in the shoes of another person and then to evaluate our point of view from their angle, so to say. It doesn't mean that we have to agree or disagree. It's not the point of the practice. It is just to be able to see it from a different standpoint of view that is not naturally ours. Okay. And that you're going to see, it's quite an intriguing practice. And if we would be able to train ourselves to look at every situation from another person's point of view, I think we would overcome a lot of confusion and conflicts. And if we are able to do that, is then to determine what our action would be. You can see that philosophical practices are for free for anybody who wishes to engage. But I think that this is quite a beautiful practice that can be done at any point in time. We need to remember to do it. And above all, we need to have enough courage to do it with ourselves and determination, because we need to develop a new quality, a new ability within ourselves that we are not used to. I wanted to share the only one quote that we actually have from Hypatia. And probably you can find it on the internet. If you Google for Hypatia quote, nothing more will appear. But it is to reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. Life is an unfoldment, and the further we travel, the more truth we can comprehend. To understand the things that are at our door is the best preparation for understanding those that lie beyond. So if out of all of this we can take away just a few little keys and practice them, I would be very happy. The one parting thought is, whenever we are faced with uncertainty and complexity of life, the only way to face it with confidence and courage and above all dignity, a human dignity, is by developing and connecting with timeless values, with developing our moral compass so that we can navigate the map of life. It's something that is within you and I, but we need to actively engage in order to develop it. In Hindu philosophy, they would say is to gain moral character, moral stamina, that is to stay stability and steadiness of character. What we need to do is to overcome our fear and then engage into the inner battle. Because in reality, it's not the external challenge that troubles us, is the inner challenge, inner limitation that we need to overcome. And then we are going to have a different point of view at the problems that we face outside. So is that apatheia, is to not desire a life to be a certain way, but to accept life for what it is, accept my own reality as a person, and at the same time to have enough imagination and courage to engage into the inner progression, developing a moral character, so I can improve. Why? Because I recognize that as a citizen of the world, which is often what we say we are, I also carry the responsibility to be an example of certain values that I choose to be. Because let's be honest, if we do not pursue, if we don't aspire to bring to life in the collectivity the human, universal human values, well, we need to ask ourselves, what are we sharing with others?